Okay, hello. Thanks for tuning in. This is Chapter 4. It's really good that you've joined me today because I think Chapter 4 is probably the hardest chapter in the entire book. There's so many new terms, there's so many vocabulary words, there are so many things that we're going to keep learning about over the course of the semester that are introduced in this chapter. Chapter 4, Section 1 is all about population. Now, it's not about specific populations in the world, it's about populations in general, how populations change and develop over time. And the way populations grow and change is through a variety of interactions between living organisms. So the birth rate is the number of births per year for every 1,000 people. The death rate is the number of deaths per year for every 1,000 people. Natural increase, or the growth rate, is the difference between the area's birth and the death rates. So if 5 people are born and 3 people die, the population has increased by 2. It's that simple. Whereas if only 3 people are born and 5 people die, that means the population actually shrunk by 2 people. This is just called the natural increase. Another factor that influences populations' growth and change is migration. Migration is the movement of people from place to place. So population changes depending on how many people are born, die, and migrate to and from an area. Now today, most industrialized economies have low birth rates and low death rates. So women and men have access to a lot of birth control, they have access to education and jobs, which takes them out of the house, and they also have lower death rates because people are safer, there's less murder, less disease, good medicine, stuff like that. Whereas in underdeveloped countries, there's usually a much higher birth rate and a higher death rate. And this is because these places have challenges in growth, like they have a hard time finding food or water or clothing or medical supplies, which leads to more people dying. People in underdeveloped countries often have less access to education and birth control and family planning means, which means that there's more children being born as well. In most places in the world, there are positive growth, meaning the population is getting bigger. But there are a few places, especially in industrialized countries, that have negative growth, meaning that the populations are actually getting smaller. Geographers look at how populations grow and shrink, but they also look at how population is distributed, because it's not distributed evenly on the globe. The population distribution is the pattern of human settlement in a particular area. So most people live near water or rivers, and also by sources of food. They try and avoid living in extreme environments like deserts usually, or unless you're Santa Claus, like the poles. Usually it's too cold for humans to live there. Population density determines how crowded a country or a region is by studying the number of people living on a square mile or kilometer of land. So it's basically the concentration of people in a particular area. So when you look at 1 square kilometer, Canada has on average very few people on that particular square if you just grouped it based on how much land. Whereas Bangladesh, if you were to take that same area, distribute the population evenly, would have a much higher concentration of people living there. Geographers also look at how populations move. People recently especially have been moving from rural areas to urban areas. They've been moving from farms to cities. This is a process known as urbanization. But people can also move by leaving a place. This is called emigration, where people leave one place and go to another. Now we're going to shift gears completely and move to talking about different cultures. Now again, we're not talking about specific cultures, we're talking about cultures in a more broad, introductory sense. So culture is the way of life of a group of people who share similar beliefs, customs, and values. It underlies everything that we do. It is the foundation of our lives. But it's really hard to define what culture is, because values, for one thing, change. People are different, so they have different values, different beliefs. Even within a society, people don't believe the same things. For the purposes of this class, we're just going to be talking about culture as a product of language, religion, social groups like families or classes, which are groups of people ranked according to ancestry or wealth or education, and also ethnic groups. We'll also be looking at governments and economies to see how those shape the culture of different places around the world. Geographers have grouped the world into regions, cultural regions. These include countries that have certain cultural traits in common. Now, culture, which underlies everything, is not something that's stagnant. It's always changing. These changes are caused by internal factors within a society, like new ideas, new lifestyles, new inventions. Things that are being introduced into society that weren't there before change how people live. It can also come from the outside, through trade or through migration, new people coming in with new ideas, or war. The process of spreading new knowledge from one culture to another is called cultural diffusion, which is another type of way that societies, cultures, can actually change. Now we're going to shift gears to political and economic systems. These are hard because in the future you're going to have two classes about these subjects. You're going to have government, and you're also going to have econ, which are going to go into way more depth on these topics. But for the sake of this class, I just want to have you guys be introduced to these topics. So first, let's talk about levels of government. Now, there's kind of basically two types. There's a unitary system, which gives all the key power to a national government in the capital. And then there's a federal system, which divides power between a national government and a state government or a provincial government. That's what we have in the United States. That's why we have a government in Indianapolis, and we also have a government in Washington. So governments are organized in that particular way, but they're also organized by types of government. Any system of government in which the power and authority to rule belong to a single individual is called an autocracy. The most common throughout human history type of autocracy has been a monarchy, which includes kings and queens. More recently, it has also included dictators like Kim Jong-un in North Korea. A monarchy is a form of autocracy in which the king or queen inherits the rule of the country or the land or whichever thing they rule over. An oligarchy is a system of government in which a small group holds power. Not just one individual, but it's distributed maybe among families or among powerful individuals. These two types of power holding were very common. There are only a few examples until recently where a democracy has been the preferred system of government. A democracy is any system of government in which leaders rule with the consent of the citizens. That means like citizens are like, yeah, it's cool if you're in charge of us. You know, we'll give up some of our power as long as you represent our interests. There are two types of democracies. There's a direct democracy in which citizens themselves decide the issues. So everybody votes on different things. The other way is called a republic. We have a republic in the United States because we elect representatives to go to the Capitol and decide on the issues on behalf of the citizens. So we're not voting, we're letting our representatives vote in Indianapolis or Washington or even in local governments. So that's a really brief, quick introduction to different types of governments. Now we're going to switch gears again to economies. An economy is something that you participate in every time you buy something or sell something. All economic systems, all economies, decide what goods and services should be produced, how they should be produced, how many should be produced, and who gets the goods and services that are produced in an economy. For most of human history, there was a traditional economy, meaning habit and customs determined the rules for economic activity. More recently, there has been the introduction of what's called a market economy. So individuals and private groups began to make decisions about what to produce. It was based on free enterprise, the idea that private individuals or groups have the right to own property and businesses and make a profit. More importantly, within a market economy, there's very limited government interference. So the government isn't saying, hey, you have to buy this, you have to sell this. The government is very hands-off. This is what became known as capitalism. Now the problem with capitalism is that people are really greedy, and a lot of times they do things that aren't really very nice. So people began developing a mixed system, a mixed economy, in which the government is supporting and is regulating free enterprise through decisions that affect the market. People are still free to do what they want, but the government is going to set up rules to keep them from cheating the system. And then finally, this gave way recently because of inequalities that often developed to command economies. A command economy is one in which the government owns and directs the means of production and the controls of distribution. So meaning they control the factory, they control the hospital, they control everything, and then decides how people should be able to buy and sell goods. Now, one example of a command economy that you've probably heard of is communism. Communism requires strict government control of almost the entire society, especially the economy. The government decides how much to produce, how to distribute those goods and services, and also elements of life of the people in the society. Another thing you've probably heard of is socialism. Socialism allows more free enterprise, but also attempts to equally distribute wealth through the control of services and factories. Some would argue that it's more of a mixed economy depending on the role of the government. Again, this is a very generalized picture of different economic systems. So that finishes out Chapter 4, Section 3, which brings us to Chapter 4, Section 4, which is Resources, Trade, and the Environment. So scattered throughout the world are elements that come from the earth that are not made by people, but we can use them. We can use them for food or fuel or other necessities. These are called natural resources. Now there's kind of two types. There's renewable resources, which can't be used up or can be replaced naturally or can be regrown if they're a type of plant. And then there's also non-renewable resources, which can't be replaced. These include things like minerals and fossil fuels like coal and oil. We kind of divide up the world based on the levels of industrialization. So countries that have large amounts of technology and manufacturing in their country are called developed countries. Other countries in the world are still working to develop high levels of manufacturing and technologies. These places are called developing countries. Now, a lot of this is shaped because the Earth has an unequal distribution of natural resources. So countries have to trade for natural resources that they don't have. Now, because they're unevenly distributed on the globe, different countries have different advantages. Some governments set up barriers to trade, like tariffs, which are a tax on imports or exports. Other governments, however, are like, let's not do that because it might hurt our economy. They want free trade. And this involves removing those trade barriers so that goods can flow freely among countries. A lot of times this can be beneficial for some countries and can actually hurt others, so it's all about striking a balance within the world economy. So this is a really challenging chapter. It introduces a lot of terms, which we're going to be working with all for like the next 2 weeks, trying to develop our understanding about these terms. If you have any questions, feel free to look some of the stuff up on the internet. There's tons of cool resources that explain some of these topics. Also bring questions to class or come and ask me. Have a great day, everyone.